Hi class, today we're going to be discussing Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, Book 3. I hope you've been enjoying some of these lectures and that they've been helpful to you. As we sort of move into this idea of virtue and character ethics, I hope it's becoming clear to you how this differs from other ways of doing ethics. We're talking about sort of the transformation of the person from the inside out. Virtue ethics is not just about resolving moral conflict or trying to figure out what to do in a moral dilemma, but becoming the kind of person that sees things clearly and appropriately, that feels the right ways in appropriate situations, and that has the internal character and fortitude to act in the right ways or to act virtuously in the world. So this is not just about knowing what to do. It's transforming ourselves in such a way that we become the kinds of people that can do it, the kinds of societies that actually live and act and look a particular way. These are not just individual actions. We're talking about dispositions of character, general dispositions of virtue that say, I'm the kind of person who has a natural tendency to be loving or courageous or honest. Though what we're digging into and exploring is, how do we become that kind of person? What does it take to become virtuous, to cultivate this kind of character, to participate in many respects in spiritual formation? Before I dig into some of the specifics in Book 3, I just want to talk generally. I made some analogies last lecture about cooking and athletics, and I want to dig a little deeper. Sports and athletics are integral parts of our culture, at least in the United States. Football and baseball, basketball, the Olympics, these things are just wildly popular. Many of us played on sports teams. Many of us coach now I'm actively engaged in watching sports. So I want to highlight some of the things about athletic communities that we might take away from, analogies we might make to this notion of virtue and character. Okay? So athletics asks that one be part of a disciplined community, striving towards a common goal. There are exceptions to this, because you have individual sports, but let's place this in the context of a team sport. I am an individual, I am part of a community, but not just any community, not if we take it seriously, but a disciplined community. I'm basically saying I will practice, I will work out, I will travel, I will discipline myself so that I can play my part in this community as we strive towards success, a championship, victory. So it's not just any kind of community, it's a disciplined community, right? In order to be successful, every member of the team must be on the same page. We know where we're headed. We know the telos, the goal. And we have an ultimate telos, maybe like to win a championship, but then we have intermittent telos, right? Today the goal might be to learn how to dribble a basketball. Today the goal might be how to learn a particular play. Today might be going over situations that we might face in the game and learning them. So we have these small goals for practice and whatnot, and those play a role in this larger goal of winning individual games and ultimately the championship. We have to be on the same page, aiming at the same goal, heading towards the same telos. Success on athletic teams requires a set of common virtues. The people on the team don't have to be the same, but certainly we want there to be a sense of loyalty, a hard work ethic, courage, toughness often. We want there to be a sense of competitiveness. We need you to be a member of a team, so you have to be able to participate in teamwork. There are certain virtues that we all have to have, even in the midst of our many, many differences. And that's part of what it means to be a disciplined community, is that we're going to sort of embody certain virtues. Finally, success demands leadership. We're going to need a coach, probably a set of coaches, but we're also going to need players who lead, right, and set a particular example with regard to the goal with regard to the virtues, with regard to how, work ethic and all of that, right? Now, can you think of other places, other contexts where these same things might apply? Right? I can think of one off the top of my head, the military. The military is a disciplined community. It's a group of people surrendering some of their individual wants and desires that I might join a larger group that have core virtues, right? And the virtues might shift slightly whether you're a Marine or in the Army or in the Air Force, but there's a set of virtues. There's leadership. We have a common goal. We only achieve that goal when we begin to cultivate that virtue as a group, striving towards that telos. We've got a bunch of intermittent goals, like through training and whatnot, shooting. There's discipline in how you make your bed, how you dress, right? There's all kinds of things that begin to prepare you to be a certain kind of person so that when battle comes to you, you're ready. Your natural reaction is not to run. It's not to fumble around with your gun. It's to know exactly what to do when a certain situation arises because you've trained. Just like in sports, you've prepared and trained. You're part of a disciplined community with a common goal. And when the situation arises, you don't think, oh no, what do I do with the ball? You know what to do because you've been practicing. But we might think of the church this way as well, the Christian community. In fact, I think maybe we should. I think the church has lost its way, at least a lot of churches have lost their way in this regard. We want to be a welcoming community. We want to be a place where people come and are welcome. But are we a disciplined community? Are we a community that says there are certain things that we do as Christians, we're not perfect, we don't do them perfectly. In fact, part of Christian discipline is confession and repentance, recognizing our sinfulness and reliance on God. But part of that is discipline, doing it, confessing, praying, going to our neighbors and to God and asking for forgiveness, saying we're not perfect, asking for grace. Have we lost our sense of discipline? Bible reading, Eucharist, fasting, prayer, tithe, all of these things that sort of form us and shape us into the kinds of people we're supposed to be so that we can develop Christian virtue, that we can become virtuous people in the midst of a virtuous community that has a common goal, a common telos. And we might have intermittent teloses along the way, right? We start working on prayer, and hopefully part of prayer cultivates a sense of dependence on God. And that virtue leads to humility, right? So we do these little things to hopefully achieve larger goals, which ultimately will lead to the ultimate telos. We need leadership. We've got to have a pastor, a set of pastors, and we also need leadership in the congregation to show us the way. What does a disciplined community look like? What does a disciplined individual look like? What does a virtuous individual look like? So successful churches have cast a vision that gets their parishioners on board, that has leadership, and that has a sense of discipline and the cultivation of virtue, in my opinion. And Aristotle's dealing with the same kind of thing, but just not in the context of the church. He's talking about it in a political context. How do we shape rulers, leaders? What kind of virtue and character should they have? He's dealing with it in another context, but in some sense, there's parallels. I think there's something right going on here, and something that maybe we've lost, right? We'll be talking some about this as we continue to go along. One of the things I want to mention is the importance of moral exemplars. So within this virtue theory, within this idea of character ethics, moral exemplars become vital. And what I mean by that is moral examples or moral leaders. Aristotle refers to them as magnanimous people. If you want to know what virtue looks like, look to the magnanimous person, the one who embodies virtue, and you will see, right, what it looks like. I think it's really important to start here, or at least this should happen sometime early on. We identify those people that we want to be like morally. What about them do we want to emulate, right? This makes ethics much more empirical, right? Because we can see what these people do. We can see what virtuous dispositions they have or do not have. And we can see the outcome. Does it lead to their own flourishing or not? So it has this empirical or tangible component because I can actually find this person in my church, my community, that embodies courage, or that embodies love, or that embodies grace, or that embodies generosity. And now I can begin to study that in some way. What do these people do that enable them to be so generous? What practices, habits, disciplines do they engage in that allow them to be loving? Right? And I can get my eyes on that, and that helps. Moral exemplars are also important, and I would call them saints, right? We have a cloud of witnesses, people that have gone before. We can point to Christ as a moral exemplar. Sometimes that's tough because he's so perfect, right? I can't achieve that. But what about saints in our own congregations and in the church history that have shown us that we can also be virtuous, right? That we also can be exemplars. Can we look to them and say, I see now, right? This notion of what our telos is as Christians is embodied by this individual, and I can see it in action, and I can see its fruit. And maybe most importantly, I can begin to imitate these people. I can do what they do. How do I become a particular kind of person? Habits and practice. How do I know what habits and practices? Find people that are better than you at being generous, loving, kind, and compassionate, and then do what they do. Imitate. Over time, if I imitate enough, I will begin to imbibe it. It gets inside of me. My character begins to change, and then I can act from a sense of who I am rather than simply imitating. So it starts with imitation, but doesn't stop there. Who are the people in your life? Who are the moral exemplars in your life that you look to? It might, C.S. Lewis for me might be one, right? He's not alive anymore, but certainly when I read his writings and look to his life, there's something to imitate. So maybe there are some historical examples. Who from the scriptures? What did they do to become the kind of people they were? Who in your congregations? Right? This is so vital for character development. All right. So those are some general comments. Let me get into book 3 a little bit. One of the interesting things, and you see the paragraph numbers here, he talks about is this idea of means and ends. And we've been talking about ends with this notion of telos, what we're aiming at or striving toward. And Aristotle says something interesting in book 3. He says, we can wish for ends, but we can deliberate and intend means. We have more control over means than we do ends. We can hope for ends, wish for ends, but we can't simply make those things happen. Instead, we can deliberate on and intentionally strive after the means, right, in some way. What does that mean, right? Well, in some sense, if we talk about eudaimonia, happiness, human flourishing, as the ultimate telos for Aristotle, you can't just wake up and say, I'm going to flourish today. I decide to be happy today. Many times you can't, that's not a choice you can make. I would argue you can't. Because happiness is not just a way you feel. It's a state of your life, right? It's a flourishing that goes on. So Aristotle says I can hope for happiness and flourishing. I can wish for it. But if I'm going to get there, I have to figure out what means will lead me to that end. What actually will lead to flourishing? That I can begin to emphasize. That I can intend and that I can control. So Aristotle suggests only the virtuous person can truly flourish or be happy. So if happiness is your goal, you can't just choose happiness, but you can begin to try to choose virtue, which will ultimately lead you to happiness or to flourishing. So that's, in some sense, what he has in mind between means and ends. But there's more. I can't just wake up and say, I choose to be courageous today. I choose it. I can't wake up and say, I choose to be compassionate or generous or loving today. Those things come about through a lot of time and practice. For someone who's a coward, They can't just wake up and say, I'm going to be courageous now. Maybe in moments, but their ultimate character will eventually catch up with them. Same thing with temperance or generosity or any of those. So if I have an intermittent goal of courage, then I have to do a bunch of little things along the way that will help shape me so that I am courageous as my second nature. It's part of my character. And in so doing, I will begin to achieve human flourishing or happiness. So I've got this intermittent goal, a particular virtue, which helps lead me to my ultimate goal, happiness. And it would be the same with all the virtues. And this is where habits come in. So I wake up and I say, I want virtue in this particular area. What practices or habits will help me cultivate that virtue, which will then eventually lead to my ultimate telos, happiness? I think there's something right about that. I tell students all the time, I don't even choose what I believe all the time. There are certain things I can't choose to believe in good conscience. It would be a lie for me to say, yes, I believe that. If someone presented me with Buddhism, I couldn't just say, oh, I choose to believe that. That's not a choice I can make. I've read it, I've heard it, I'm not convinced by it. I'm just not. So it's not even a choice I can make. If it's a choice that I wanted to make, then I would have to do a lot of things that might prepare my heart to be able to make that choice. So when students are struggling with Christianity and they don't know what to believe, and is it just something my parents raised me with? How do I deal with that? I typically say, well, if this is something you want to believe, it's not just an intellectual thing. You don't just assent to it intellectually. Go to church. Read your Bible. Pray. Take 6 months and try to engage in these practices and habits and see if this doesn't become something now that you believe, right? You can't just skip all of the work and get to this place that you want to get to. You have to do a bunch of little steps to become the kind of person that this now is convincing to, right? I hope that makes sense in some way. And so we can't just choose the ends. We identify the ends, we set them as our goals, and then we figure out what can I do, what can I choose to help me achieve them, right? And this relates with what he talks about with moral responsibility. He talks a lot about voluntary action and involuntary action. I'm morally responsible to the extent that I have failed to cultivate my own character through habits and disciplines. Those things I can control, I failed to do that, and now I'm just the kind of person who steals, right? It might even look like an involuntary action because it's just part of who I am, part of what I do. But what I'm responsible for is allowing myself over time to become that person, right? And I think this has a lot to do with desire, right? And this is something that's very unique to virtue theory and character-based ethics, that how I feel and what I desire is so incredibly relevant. So I'm in college, right? I deal with college students, and it's not uncommon to be talking with a student and then, sort of lamenting, I just always seem to be attracted to the wrong kinds of people. The wrong girls. I'm always attracted to bad boys. What is that? Right? Most recently, I was talking to a student, and she was lamenting that there was this really great guy who liked her, and she knew he was interested, but she just didn't find him attractive. She just couldn't see herself with him, even though it seemed like he'd be a great fit in certain ways. And instead, she was with this guy who she knew wasn't good for her. Was wrong in many ways, but there's something appealing, right? It's sort of attractive about that. And then the question came up, well, can I control who I'm attracted to? And at one level, you want to say no. You certainly cannot help it, right? You find certain people attractive and other people you don't find attractive. And you can't really explain that, and you can't just choose. I just choose to be attracted to this person. You either are or you are not. Not a choice you can make. But it's possible that we can identify this and say, man, I find myself attracted to the wrong things. I find myself desiring the wrong things. I can't change that, but I can begin in little ways to do things that might ultimately reshape my desires, reshape my attractions. As I become a different kind of person, what I want, who I'm attracted to, and what I desire also changes, right? So what I can control are the little things each day that make me a particular kind of person that wants and desires the right kinds of things. It probably means cutting off, in this case with a student, cutting off conversation with the guy that's not good for you. If you know that, stop emailing, Facebooking, and talking. You don't have to run to the other guy, the nice guy that you rejected. Just stay single and begin to think about, why do I want those things that I shouldn't want, and I reject those things that I ought to want? What is it in me? And how can I work on that? How can I develop virtue in such a way that my character changes and so my desires change? And Aristotle believed this was possible. I believe this is possible, but many people don't. There are many people that say you cannot change your desires and your attractions. There's nothing you can do to reshape them. And I think on one level that's true. I can't just wake up one day and change them. But over time, through slow practice and habituation, I can, as I become a person of God. Now, of course, as a Christian, I think this is through the Holy Spirit and God's grace and whatnot. I'm an active participant in that, though. Can I shape who I am and thus my desires? And as I begin to desire the right things, you see how that makes it easier to choose the right things. I'm not fighting my inclination anymore, but instead, what I desire is what is the good and the virtuous and the just. That's the ultimate goal of virtue-based ethics. And I think the ultimate goal of a disciplined community like the church, right? That we begin to want those things that are good for us. One of the virtues that Aristotle focuses on in Book 3 is courage, right? And he gives a quote here, paragraph 1115b. He that endures and fears what he ought from the right motive and in the right manner and at the right time, and similarly, that person would have confidence with the right motive and in the right manner and at the right time, that person is courageous. I want you to hear the golden mean in this language, the balance. The golden mean says that the virtue is in between two extremes. If you have too much confidence, you're foolhardy. You run into danger without thinking. If you have too much fear, you're cowardly and you don't act when you should act. Courage falls in the middle. But the golden mean also says virtue is about acting in the right way, for the right reason, the right motive, in the right manner, at the right time, in the right amount. It is about hitting that mean, right? Courage is no different. Courage is about fearing the right things and having confidence in the right things. Having fear at the right time and in the right amount, having confidence at the right time and in the right amount. This takes an incredible amount of practice. So for instance, Aristotle says, fear can be good as long as you fear the right kinds of things. The noble person, the person of good character, fears things like disgrace. You should be afraid of disgrace, and that fear can motivate you to act nobly and courageously. Right? There's a noble end involved with courage. Right? He often says that this happens in battle, fighting political battles, on the war front. A noble end, right? But if I'm afraid of what people think, then I'm not fearing the right kinds of things. You see how emotions and desires need to be shaped. Initially, I fear the wrong kinds of things. I fear death. He says the courageous person should overcome their fear of death and be able to act courageously. I fear what people might say about me. The courageous person overcomes those kinds of fears. But I should fear disgrace and act accordingly. So I learn to fear the right things and overcome fear in the right ways. Right? This golden mean, the right amount at the right time for the right reason. A person with good character knows that sometimes they need to speak up and speak their mind, but in other contexts, the virtue calls for you to shut your mouth and not say a word. You need to develop virtue so that you know what is required in a given situation. The virtue of courage is no different. What is required? What does courage demand in this situation? The person with a courageous disposition knows and acts accordingly. But often, man, I am influenced by, is someone watching? Will I get credit for this? What will people think of me if I say this? I don't want to stir the pot or cause trouble. Those are excuses, right? We become peacekeepers because we don't really want to be courageous. And I assume some of you are going through this in your own life, whether it's with your spouse, whether it's with people of your congregation, particular groups that are creating problems. And again, you want to keep the peace, but at some point, what does courage really demand? It doesn't mean being mean or rude or acting out of anger, but it also means not allowing fear to dictate what we do. And so how do we become people of courage? What practices and habits might enable us to do what we need to do? We can't just wake up and choose to be courageous if we're not. We have to wake up and choose little steps that we might do every day that enable us to embody the virtue. And then Aristotle mentions temperance. Temperance basically means moderation, self-control, restraint. And for Aristotle, it means moderation, self-control, restraint with regard to pleasures of touch and taste. Eating, drinking, sex. Doing these in excess is not being temperate. Right? Temperate is being balanced as a person, being moderate, showing self-control. We're not very temperate as a culture. Temperance is not really a virtue, right? It's about more, bigger houses, more cars, more food, stuff my face, give me more options, more choices, more freedom, more sex, more pornography. I mean, this is, right, what we're engaged in. But Aristotle says to be virtuous, in fact, many of the other virtues rely on you being temperate. You can't cultivate other virtues if you don't first cultivate a sense of temperance. But temperance in many respects is shaping your desire, curbing your desire for sex, curbing your desire for more, for more materialism, more comfort, more stuff. So we have to identify those ways where our desires have gotten out of control, where we've turned a want into a need. I need my cell phone, my iPad, my next bit of technology. I have to have it. How do I curb my desires in such a way that I become a temperate person and I put them in their proper place, right? How do I find that sense of balance? And this is a great quote from Aristotle at the very end of Book 3. And so the appetites, desires, wants of the temperate man should be in harmony with his reason. So reason is in control of desire, not the other way around. For the aim of both is that which is noble. The temperate man desires what he ought, as he ought, when he ought, as reason prescribes. See here the golden mean again, right? Right context, right amount, right reason. The temperate man desires what he should desire. That means for Aristotle to win this argument, he has to convince you that your desires can really be shaped. But you don't wake up one day and say, I'm just going to choose not to desire sex as much as I do. I'm going to choose not to desire to be a glutton as much as I do. I'm going to choose today not to want the newest car or house. You can't just wake up and choose that. It's little steps. It's forming yourself along the way, shaping you in such a way that now my desires are reshaped as my character is reshaped. My desires are brought into balance as my spirit has been formed. I hope this is sinking in, right? I hate to be redundant, but this is what Aristotle is getting at within this chapter, right? The last slide, the last thing I want to talk about in this particular lecture, Aristotle throughout Nicomachean Ethics, and you're not reading the whole book, so I'm going to sort of piece together some of this that you're not reading. He makes a strong connection between the individual and the community. This book is not just about an individual cultivating virtuous character. This is about political leaders setting the standard for the whole community. What does a virtuous community look like? He doesn't make much distinction between the individual and the community. The community itself needs to embody the virtues of courage and temperance and pride, right? Kindness. So this is not only on an individual plane, but it really is a communal argument. But look at our current culture and society. when it comes to temperance, it's just out of control. I mean, capitalism really only functions if we overconsume, overproduce, right? If we continue to strive for more money, bigger homes, better cars, this is what keeps the economy moving forward, right, is production and consumption. How do I put that in perspective and say, in the midst of this society, I want to live in a community, namely the church, that says no to that and wants to live with the virtue of temperance? That what I really desire is not more things, but more of God. That my desire is to, I want to desire what God desires. I want to will what God wills. And I think that's not me being more comfortable, more wealthy, having a bigger place, but something more than that. So I need to be shaped in a community that is not the United States, but rather my argument would be the church, where we're striving for a different set of virtues, a different set of values. And for Aristotle, right, human flourishing can only take place when the community embodies virtue. I think this is also true. So I flourish to the extent that my local church flourishes. I embody virtue and am aided in that pursuit to the extent that my church is embodying this and is being a disciplined community. You know, one of the interesting things about both Plato and Aristotle and just Greek society in general is that the focus was not on the individual. The focus was on the polis, or the city. So part of being a virtuous individual is that I have to figure out what my role is in the community and give my gifts and talents to that community. So the community is not here to serve me. I'm here to serve the community. So I cannot truly flourish until I figure out, what am I really good at? What are my gifts, and how do I cultivate them to become excellent at them, right? Virtue is about excellence. And then I pour that back to the group. So group comes first, individual comes second. I think that's the way the church was intended, and I think that's what we see in the book of Acts in the early church. It's about bringing our resources together to make sure the individuals of our community have their needs met. It's about saying we are many parts but one body. We cannot see if the eyes of our community do not play their role. The body cannot feel unless the hands of our community play their role. We all have to be pouring our gifts back into the church so that we might function as one body together to sort of make that ultimate telos a reality on earth as it is in heaven. And so I have to say, it's not about me. It's about God, and it's about the church. Can we refocus that? Because I think so often American values of individualism, consumerism, capitalism, egoism have sort of seeped into our everyday life. And I think we need to question that and maybe break away from some of that and reconceive of what it means to be Christian, what it means to be the church, and what it means to be a disciplined community. I hope this helps. I'd love your feedback and keep the discussion going as you move through Aristotle. So I'll look forward to seeing you guys online.